When a little boy lost his mother, he was supposed to be taken care of by his uncle, but they gave him up for adoption and forgot about him. But a few years later, he surprisingly showed up at her house in the most unbelievable way. "We can't keep it," Marcela yelled at her husband. "Juarez, we have to think of ourselves and our children." "But he's just a child," Vicente said, biting his lip. Perhaps his wife was right, but the idea of giving up his dead sister's child was too terrible. "I do not care. He is not our responsibility. I will feed another mouth. It's hard enough to make ends meet without it. If you don't, I'll leave you and take our children away." She screamed, and Juarez felt he had no choice. She called the social services who had contacted them after her sister's death, because she was her only family. And Paul gave them. He would never forget the look in the boy's eyes as he walked out of his house hand in hand with the social worker. Paul looked at him with sadness and disappointment. Clearly, the boy had no idea where he was going, but he knew Juarez and his family got rid of him. "May God forgive me," Vicente said, and he heard the woman mock him as they walked back to the house. 25 years later, Juarez was repairing his front porch with his son Diego. After she suddenly collapsed. The house was very run down, but they couldn't even think of moving. Of their 3 children, Diego was the only one who had moved out and lived in a small studio a few miles from them. His other son, Fabio, played all day. He decided to become a Twitter star, or whatever that means. "I would like to get a real job," Juarez thought often, but he didn't dare say anything to prevent Marcela from getting upset with him. Meanwhile, her daughter Andressa became pregnant at the age of 18 and the baby's father abandoned her. So the mother and daughter lived with them. Marcela took care of her grandson while the young woman worked as a cashier at a local supermarket. Juarez continued to support everyone but Diego, but his eldest son often stopped by the house to raid the pantry. The situation was very difficult. Money was tight and he was unable to save anything for retirement. He wanted his children to be more independent, but Marcela spoiled them too much. She acknowledged that times were tougher now, but the reality was that her kids didn't seem to be trying very hard in school or anything. And now? Juarez felt trapped, supporting everyone, as he probably would until the day in which to depart from this for the better. As he hammered the wood and asked Diego to pass him a few more nails, Juarez remembered Paulo. It had been years since he last thought of his nephew. At first the guilt was tremendous, but then life distracted him. Juarez didn't know why he had thought of his nephew at that moment, but he hoped that Paulo had been adopted by a good family. Surprisingly, a limousine pulled up on her street and parked right in front of her house. "Damn!" Diego exclaimed, surprised. Juarez narrowed his eyes, wiped the sweat from his forehead as he straightened. He wondered who was in the limo and why it was in his neighborhood. Vehicles like this have never been seen around here. The driver got out and walked around the luxury car to open the back door. A businessman in an elegant gray suit and sunglasses stepped out. He took a few steps into his courtyard and looked at his house. Juarez saw that she had a sad expression and felt something cold run down his spine. The kind of feeling I had. When something bad is going to happen, someone is in trouble. That man is a lawyer. Do I owe someone money? Marcela did something wrong. Questions raced through Juarez's mind as he stripped off his work gloves and walked down the porch stairs. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked and felt Diego behind him. The man was silent for a few moments as he glared at him with an angry expression. Juarez felt his gaze through his dark glasses, and the feeling of dread increased. Finally, the man raised his hand and removed his glasses, revealing a face that Juarez recognized anywhere. I couldn't believe it. Juarez was in shock. I knew who he was. He knew the man in front of him. Well, it was none other than Paulo. "Hello, Uncle Juarez," the man said stoically. "Paul, what a surprise. Good to see you," Juarez said, feeling the sweat run down his back. He bit his lower lip again with the embarrassment of that moment. He had no idea what to say to the boy he had abandoned years ago. "Paul?" Diego asked. "He is your cousin. You met him briefly when you were little," Juarez said. His children couldn't remember Paulo because they were so young at the time of the tragedy. They were younger than their nephew, who was only 5 at the time. "You must be Diego, right?" Paul said. A slight smile formed on his mouth as he looked at Juarez's son. His shorts were torn and dirty from construction and his hair was messed up, and Juarez didn't look much better. "Want to come in for a drink?" Juarez offered and Paulo immediately shook his head. "Thanks. But this is not a social visit." He just needed to see this place to put the past behind him. Paulo commented but stopped when they heard the front door open and his wife, daughter and granddaughter came out. "Look, there's the bad witch." "What did you say?" Diego asked, offended. Paulo looked at his cousin and smiled. "I mean, your mother, the evil witch who told Uncle Juarez to get rid of me. Years ago, when my mother died and Uncle Juarez didn't have the courage to confront her. Apparently, he still hasn't. It's sad," she explained, leaving him speechless. Juarez lowered his eyes, embarrassed. He knew exactly why he had been afraid before. He had done something terrible years ago and he didn't think he could pay for it. There was. "You can't say that about my mother. Except when Diego is angry." "Calm down," said Paulo, in a condescending tone. "I'm out of here in a minute. I just came to tell Uncle Juarez that, even though I acted cowardly, I have a lot to be thankful for. I was adopted by the best parents in the world. I got a scholarship and started my own business. I'm doing very well and now I see that this would never have happened if I had stayed with you." Paulo turned his head, looked directly at Juarez and smirked. The women approached and heard everything. "Get out of my backyard right now." Marcela started screaming, followed by several insults. Paulo's smile was engraved in stone and Juarez could only look at his shoes, drowning in embarrassment. Finally, the visitor laughed. He put his sunglasses back on and buttoned his smart coat. "Goodbye, relatives. I hope you have a good life," he said, turning away. His driver opened the door again, but before he got in, Paulo glanced at his uncle, who looked up to make contact. His nephew shook his head again. He climbed into the limousine, pulled away, and Juarez listened to his family's complaints and insults for a few moments. He sat on the porch steps and thought about his life. Mistakes, horrible decisions and, above all, a lack of courage, as Paulo had pointed out. He felt embarrassed, but he was happy that his nephew had done well in life. Years later, Juarez finally worked up the courage to send Paulo an email after finding his company's website. He apologized from the bottom of his heart and asked about his life. Paulo accepted his apology and told him about his business, his wife, his children and his adoptive parents. They finally met for coffee. Vicente told his nephew stories of his mother that he loved. Some time later, Juarez fell ill and someone paid the hospital bill anonymously. He guessed who it had been and soon the rest of his family felt the truth. Although her children were grateful, Marcela was furious and accused Paulo of showing off his money. That was the last straw for Juarez. He packed his bags. He told his children that it was time for them to grow up and be adults. Finally. And he left town. Paulo rented an apartment for him and paid a few months in advance so that his uncle could start a new life. Although Juarez communicated with his children from time to time, he stopped sending them money. So everyone had to learn to survive on their own. In a way, his departure was very positive for the family, as everyone was forced to grow up and mature. What can we learn from this story? You have to stand up for what you think is right. Hope you enjoyed the story. Leave your like and comment something.